A number of guests, duly introduced by fellows, beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? And the minutes.
The minutes of the ordinary meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of London on Thursday, 9th of February 2023 at Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, 2nd of February 2023 were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society. Castelnadolig and the Penbryn Spoons, a new investigation by Dr. Toby Driver, FSA, and Professor Andrew Fitzpatrick, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced the next meeting would be on Thursday, 16th of February 23, then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
And I remind the meeting that following the revisions to the nomination and balloting system, blue papers are now suspended online on the Fellows platform in the Documents tab. You can find their blue papers and a paper balloting form for the next ballot, which opened on 15th February and closes on 16th of March 2023. And the blue papers for the April ballot, which will open on 16th of March and close on 27th of April 2023. And that will be the anniversary meeting. And so physical ballot boxes and cork balls will be available for voting in person on that day from 4 p.m. And admissions.
The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, desire to be admitted a fellow. John Lee.
By the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. We now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear a paper, The First History of Elizabethan England, William Camden's Annals of the Reign of Elizabeth I, by Dr. Alexandra Guyder, FSA of Jesus College, Oxford. Dr. Guyder is a John Walsh Fellow and Tutor in History at Jesus and Associate Professor of History at Oxford University. She's a historian of the political, religious, and intellectual life of England in the 16th and early 17th century. She has written books and articles on the political culture of the late Elizabethan period, the reception of classical political ideas, and the antiquarian and historical scholarship that emerged as a byproduct of the English Reformation. In particular, she's interested in the scholars and lawyers who formed the first Society of Antiquaries and the role they played in the late Elizabethan state.
While the screen is descending, I should explain this was originally meant to be a joint lecture with my colleague, Dr. Neil Younger. Neil can't be here tonight, so it's just me, I'm afraid. Any deficiencies, I hope you'll be sympathetic. So the year 2023 is for the 400th anniversary of the death of one of the greatest of British scholars, William Camden. Camden's importance to the Society of Antiquaries cannot be overstated. He was one of the founder members of the Society, or College of Antiquaries, as it was then known, in 1586. And he was one of the most active contributors to its earliest meetings. Camden's most famous for his Britannia, the first edition of which was published in 1586, which was the very first topographical and chorographical survey of the physical remains of the ancient past of Britain and Ireland. And it drew with great innovation, not only on written records, but his own research into the physical landscape. Camden was also one of the foremost pedagogues of his own day. Educated at St. Paul's and then unhappily at Oxford, he was appointed in 1575 second master and later headmaster of Westminster School. And at Westminster, he produced a definitive Greek grammar and taught some of the leading scholars and writers of the 17th century. One of his admiring pupils was the poet and playwright Ben Jonson, who wrote several epigrams for his former teacher, acclaiming him most reverend head, to whom I owe all that I am in arts. Another former pupil was the polymath statesman, scholar, and collector of manuscripts, Robert Cotton, who was later to become perhaps Camden's closest friend and certainly his closest intellectual collaborator, and whose formidable archive is now one of the greatest manuscript collections in the British Library. And of Cotton, more anon. In 1597, Camden was appointed Clarenceux King of Arms, one of the three chief heralds in the College of Arms. Now, of course, in early modern society, heralds wielded great social power. They determined and approved arms and genealogies, noble titles and degrees, and they played a central role in the pageantry associated with the royal court. And this is an image of Camden attending the funeral of Queen Elizabeth I. And yet Camden was not parochial. Through his extensive Latin correspondence, he became an enormously respected and well-connected member of the European Republic of Letters. He corresponded with some of the greatest scholars of his day, the great French historian Jacques Tatu, the pioneering geographer Abraham Ortelius, and the classical scholar and political theorist Justus Lipsius, all giants of the late 16th century Renaissance. Of Britannia, Lipsius wrote to Camden, "Not only your own country is indebted to you, but as foreigners who scarcely knew about Britain until now." At a time when history was not a formal part of the university curriculum in these Isles, Camden founded the first chair in history at any English university, and that is the Camden Chair in Civil History, now Ancient History at Oxford, which survives to this day. He lived much of his life in the precincts of Westminster Abbey, as did his friend and former pupil, Robert Cotton, inhabiting the environments of the Houses of Parliament and the Royal Court at Whitehall. And so Camden was at the centre, if not the centre, of intellectual and political life in England. His memorial in Westminster Abbey correctly immortalises him as an indefatigable, judicious and impartial researcher into British antiquities. Now, despite the veneration of his contemporaries, modern scholarly interest in Camden's life and works has really been quite uneven. The Royal Historical Society was formerly known as the Camden Society, and it still honours its name with the Camden series, and that's its prestigious printed series of editions of manuscripts. And that's been in existence since 1838. And modern scholars, Angus Vine, Daniel Wolfe, Graham Parry, have been very interested in Camden, but particularly as a pioneering scholar of antiquities of Britain, and in particular in the research for and writing of Britannia, and the seminal role he played in the intellectual life of this society. But he still received less scholarly attention than many of his peers with similar interests. And indeed, Camden's most recent modern biographer, Wyman Herendeen, whose acclaimed Life in Context was published in 2007, felt the need to justify writing the life of what he describes as a minor figure, a small figure, a service character. This is 500 pages long, this biography. In July, the Society will host a conference on Camden and his world, and scholars from all over the world will address the diverse aspects of his contribution both to scholarship and to education. Hopefully, in the quarter centenary of his death, we can pay proper tribute to his colossal contribution to intellectual life in Britain. The subject of my talk today, though, is just one of Camden's achievements. And this has been even peculiarly overlooked as a subject of academic inquiry. This is the Annales Rerum Anglicarum et Hispanicarum Regnante Elizabetha, the Annals of English and Irish Affairs in the Reign of Elizabeth I, or Camden's Annals for short. Now, this is quite simply the first full-length history of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled England between 1558 and 1603, dying when Camden was in his early 50s. In around 400,000 words of the most elegant Renaissance Latin, Camden introduced a narrative of the Queen's reign, structured on an annalistic model. That is, he divided his narrative into yearly events. And that's a model used by the classical historians Tacitus and Livy. It was published in Latin in 2 volumes, the first in 1615 and the second after Camden's death in 1625. Now, the history is not a biography of Elizabeth. It's rather a survey of the whole Elizabethan era. It's focused on the royal court and the high politics of the reign, but the work also takes in religious history, socioeconomic history, military history, and the troubled history of Elizabethan Ireland. For Camden, though, this was not a labour of love, such as the Britannia. It wasn't even a work that he had wanted to write, but a work that had been commissioned by the most powerful patrons in the land. In his preface to the Annals, Camden explained that he was first required to write a history of Elizabeth's reign by William Cecil, Lord Burley, Elizabeth's first chief minister, and he was commissioned to write this history in 1598. Now, Cecil died in the same year, and Camden seems quietly to have dropped the project. Nevertheless, some years later, Elizabeth's successor, King James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England and Ireland in 1603, appears to have urged Camden to complete the history and even to have personally ordered its publication in print. Despite the significance of Camden's subject matter and the stature of his patrons, there's no modern scholarly edition of the Annals, and no complete English translation has been undertaken since the 17th century. And there's been very little academic study of the text. A crude measure of this relative neglect can be taken from Herondeen's biography. He devotes 82 pages to discussing Britannia, several chapters to the subject of education, and 14 pages to the Annals. That's not to say that this book has not had an enormous influence since its publication in the early decades of the 17th century. Written in Latin, it aimed at a European-wide audience, and one of the first translations was actually into French in 1624, and 3 English translations had appeared by 1630, one of them written by a chaplain to King Charles I. And this monumental narrative history has been the single most important source, I suppose, what we might think of the historical memory of Elizabeth I and her era that have descended down the generations. So any kind of impressionistic ideas one might have of Elizabeth and her reign, the plucky virgin committed to marrying the country rather than a man, or the era of, the age of golden age of prosperity and cultural achievements. In some senses, they have a root in Camden's Annals. And the Annals still have a really enormous influence on modern historians' understanding of Elizabeth's reign. The narrative structures he established of high politics really still persist until today. When I began my own doctoral research into Elizabethan history, my supervisor told me that I was to start not with modish works of 20th and 21st century historians, but with Camden, whose history had been unsurpassed by anyone writing any later. And as such, modern historians still use Camden's text as a kind of primary source for the reign, in the way that we'd use a kind of contemporary account book or a letter. If it's in Camden, it's probably true. Now, this is partly because Camden wrote about the very recent past, and he'd been alive during many of the events he describes. an adult during many of the events he describes, alive during all of them. At various points, he punctuates his narrative to explain that he's relating events he had personally witnessed. So about the trial of Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, for treason in 1601, he writes, "These things at which I was present myself, I have, with uncorrupted fidelity, related." Uncorrupted fidelity. The Annals are also important for scholars beyond their illumination of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. They've also been hailed as a landmark of historical writing in England, transforming the practice for all who followed. Now, the most important proponent of this thesis is the famous historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who in a notorious lecture on Camden described this transformation in a very typically pugilistic fashion. The subtitle of Trevor Roper's lecture is William Camden and the Beginning of English Civil History. Trevor Roper claimed that Camden's genius had been to break away from the humanistic, merely literary tradition with its fictitious rhetoric and moral examples, and also from the ecclesiastical tradition, which embedded history in revelation and prophecy. In other words, Trevor Roper claimed that Camden's genius had anticipated and initiated a transition to modern historical thought and practice. The first aspect of this so-called historical revolution was, Trevor Roper argued, the emergence of the notion of the historian as an objective and analyst of past events. So a scholar who tries to understand the past in its own terms from the surviving factual evidence and not for any present-centered concerns. Now, the notion that the past could be studied objectively was largely antithetical to the manner in which Camden's 16th century and 17th century contemporaries viewed and theorized the purpose of writing history. Historians of the European Renaissance had looked to classical models of historical writing, and these viewed history as a literary art and a branch of rhetoric, intended either to have a didactic or moralizing purpose, so to inspire virtue to readers, or otherwise to teach readers prudence, that is, practical political wisdom, which could then be put into practice in public life. Renaissance historians therefore viewed history as a literary genre, a category of writing separate from the study of antiquities, that is, the physical and textual remains of the past. And as such, the historian was not wedded to a strictly accurate interpretation of the past, as defined by any kind of factual record. Rather, they were expected to use their powers of inventio, invention, to embellish their narrative of the past, or to stir emotion in the reader, and to more effectively convey a moralizing or political lesson to readers. To write great history, wrote the Elizabethan soldier poet Sir Philip Sidney, the historian must also be a poet. The other framework shunned by Camden, Trevor Roper argued, was associated with a Christian or an ecclesiastical tradition of historical writing that had been engendered by St. Augustine and Augustine's disciples. And this viewed human history as an unfolding record of divine will. Camden's pioneering brilliance, we're told, was to throw off these generic constraints. He pioneered the writing of civil or political history. He evaluated historical change as a result of human interaction in the physical world without reference to a metaphysical or supernatural framework. And he pioneered the writing of history as disinterested historical inquiry for its own sake, rather than for rhetorical or didactic purposes. As a corollary, Trevor Roper argued that Camden had revolutionized the methods used by historians. Just as he pioneered the study of the material remains of the past in Britannia, he had placed historical studies on a new basis of scientific documentation. Now, the foundations of Trevor Roper's claims are actually to be found in Camden's own words in the preface to the Annals. And in this preface, Camden is at pains to explain that history is the product of long, arduous toil with every possible piece of textual evidence at its disposal. And anyone who's ever worked in an archive, I think, can be sympathetic with this. Charters and letters, patents of kings and great personages, consultations in the council chamber, ambassadors' instructions and letters I carefully turned over, parliamentary diaries, acts and statutes. I've read over every edict or proclamation. All of these Camden Sources have been combed for the truth they reveal. It's very specific, though, that this truth is only things manifest what the sources reveal of themselves. And famously, he insists that his history is a sheer work of record, that he's not imposed any judgment on any of the events he describes. I have sifted out the judgment of others and scarcely imposed my own in any place. Now, modern scholars have taken Camden's epistle even more literally than Trevor Raper did. Wallace McCaffrey, whom I revere as one of the greatest Elizabethan historians of the 20th century, insisted, since we lack a modern annotated edition, it's not possible to identify the sources for each passage. Nevertheless, it's safe to say that behind every statement of fact stands some specific authority, written and oral. In his scrupulous respect for authentic and direct supporting evidence for every assertion he puts forward, Camden provides a model for modern historical practice. And yet, as McCaffrey well knew, aside from references to eyewitness testimony, Camden nowhere discusses the sources he used in the main body of his history, and he certainly doesn't evaluate anything. This is not a work with marginal notes that explains particular manuscripts and books that have been consulted. We've no study that evaluates whether or not Camden was scrupulous in his approach to sources he consulted and claimed to have read. Camden's self-fashioning as an objective historian has huge implications for the writing of the history of Elizabeth I's reign. As I've suggested already, historians feel that they can trust the Annals because his method is the same as our own. And so he becomes a vital resource for Elizabethan historians, filling in the gaps when the documentary or material evidence is gnomic or silent. As such, the Annals is our only source for a number of notorious episodes in Elizabeth I's reign. Now, I very soon discovered this as a fresh-faced doctoral student researching the political and intellectual interests of the circle of Robert Devereux's second Earl of Essex, a hapless rebel whose trial Camden had attended. Now, Essex had been Elizabeth's last great favourite and courtier. He was also a soldier and a nobleman renowned throughout Christendom for chivalry and valour, and he was executed for treason in 1601 to the shock of Europe. Camden provides a hugely compelling and exciting account of Essex's story, in particular, the spectacular decline of his career in the late 1590s. Now, in the summer of 1598, which is the months when Essex's career began to implode, the traditional sources that we use to write political history, state papers and the National Archives at Kew, ambassadors' accounts, correspondence of courtiers, they're strangely silent on the subject of Essex's growing disfavour at court. Camden provides the only full and coherent account of what allegedly happened. He explains that there were bitter disputes about foreign policy on the Privy Council, and that Essex and William Cecil Lord Burleigh clashed irreconcilably over proposals that England make peace with their enemy, Spain. It's from Camden that we have a memorable vignette of Lord Burleigh, who's the model for Shakespeare's Polonius, sanctimoniously pointing Essex to Psalm 55, men of blood shall not live out half their days. And it's from Camden that we know that there was a drastic confrontation between Elizabeth and Essex soon after, which caused the Earl to retreat dramatically from the court in disgrace. Now, around this time, Essex's name stops appearing on the registers of the Privy Council. So we know he's not at court, and we have some letters that still survive of his friends frantically writing to him, telling him to make up with Elizabeth and to go and grovel at her feet. But they don't describe what the cause of the altercation was. Ends Camden. Following a dispute over patronage in Ireland, we learn from the Annals that the Queen physically boxed Essex's ears. Essex put his hand on his sword, saying that he would brook no such behaviour, not even from Henry VIII himself. Now, these vignettes are the stuff of 1,000 terrible films, but they're recited as a factual account, not only in drama, but in all major scholarly accounts of Elizabethan politics. And yet the only source for them is Camden's Annals. In two brilliant articles written in the first decade of this century and near the end of a very great career, the late Cambridge scholar Patrick Collinson exhorted historians to be very wary of the claims made, both for the originality of Camden's scholarship, his claims to impartiality, and his much vaunted accuracy. Instead, Collinson suggested that we must think of Camden not as a pioneer of modern methods, but rather as a historian far more embedded in classical and humanist traditions than his preface ostensibly allows. In our obsession with Camden's allegedly scrupulous use of primary materials, which he points out no one had investigated, we've neglected to understand the literary art in the annals, the fictive powers that Camden wields. He also queries Camden's insistence that his history is impartial, that he hasn't imposed judgments on his subject matter. Now, that claim to impartiality itself, as most contemporary readers of Camden's Latin preface would know, is in fact a deliberate restatement of the very famous claim to objectivity made by the Roman historian Tacitus in the introduction to Tacitus's Annals, the Annals of Imperial Rome between the reigns of the emperors Tiberius and Nero. And in the opening paragraphs of his greatest work, Tacitus famously insisted that he wrote sine ira et studio, without indignation or partiality. Now, this claim is also famously highly ironic, although Tacitus preferred to guide his readers' judgments by insinuation rather than explicit direction. His portrait of the early Roman principates is notoriously bleak and savage, and his depiction of Roman emperors damning of their tyranny. Camden's Tacitian stance, then, has nothing to do with initiating a revolution in historical writing. Rather, he's claiming a literary kinship with the greatest historian of Rome, cementing his own place in a venerable and indeed ancient literary tradition. And he shaped his history just as Tacitus did in the form of annals. If we want to find Camden in distinctly judgmental mode, we need to turn no further than to his portrait of the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's greatest favourite, whom she seems to have loved romantically. Now, this wonderful portrait aside, modern scholars evaluate Leicester as far more than Elizabeth's discarded boyfriend, sort of gorgeous butterfly of the court. He's one of the two most important statesmen of the reign, a hugely wealthy and powerful landowner, an incredibly important patron of the arts and literature, and a promoter of zealous Protestant clergy, otherwise known as Puritans. He took a very committed ideological stance to withstanding Catholic power in Europe. Here's Camden's obituary for Leicester. He was held to be the most perfect courtier, aulicus absolutus, a free and generous patron to soldiers and scholars, skillful at serving the time in his own interests, obsequious in disposition, treacherous to his rivals, given to womanizing, in his later days, above all to uxoriousness, so obsessed with sex. While he placed jealous power before sound virtue, his detractors seized on more ample material to revile him. And when he most greatly flourished, they insolently defamed him, not without some untruths. And I will say, remember, no judgment is meant to be in this text, I will say in a single word, he was openly deemed amongst the most praiseworthy, but in secret, the majority that they heard was bad. Now, I think we can agree this is a particularly elegant kind of hatchet job, dripping with disdain for its subject matter. The way Camden describes these groups of anonymous detractors who trash Leicester's reputation and defamed him is very, very similar to the way that Tacitus tends to, detract from the reputation of his imperial subjects. He tends to report unsubstantiated and private rumors of evil conduct that can only color the reader's prejudices. Now, even Trevor Roper admitted that Camden's portrait of Leicester was a bit rum, viewing this as his hero's only failure of judicious impartiality. And yet, I'd argue there are many more that can be found. Collinson also insists that we have to give far greater attention to the variant texts of the Annals. Ideally, they should be read in Latin, in which they were first published, rather than 17th century translations, which were not written and sponsored by Camden, and are of variable quality. But also we need a full study of the original manuscripts of the Annals, particularly the Cotton Manuscripts, Faustina, F1 to 10 in the British Library. These are extensive working drafts of the first printed editions. There are nearly 2 complete autograph recensions of the whole and 3 or 4 versions of other parts. Now, it's incredibly rare we have such extensive drafts of a major literary work of this nature from this period, and therefore I think quite astonishing they've not been studied thoroughly already. When he wrote, Collinson was the only scholar who'd thought about the relationship of these drafts and the printed versions. He was only able to do so very briefly, but his discoveries are highly suggestive. Now, Camden describes the Annals as entirely his own work, but the briefest overview shows that this text has been extensively revised several times in the drafting, with input from more than one hand. So here you can see in this picture, you can see that there is sort of underlining, but when we move on to here, I don't know how clear it is, but there are corrections in a different hand, but also the pieces of the text have been pasted over the original text. And more emendation in this image. And here is a particularly, I will be returning to this, but here is a piece of text that has been inserted. It's not in the original narrative at all. This is an insertion that makes its way into the final draft, but has been extensively and consistently revised. It also becomes clear that the Annals owes a great amount to the input of Camden's former pupil at Westminster School, his great friend and neighbour, Robert Cotton. Now, Cotton, as I've said, was the greatest collector of manuscripts of his day. And his archive included a great amount of recent Elizabethan material. And so important was Cotton's library to aspiring statesmen in the 1620s that Charles I had it closed down, fearing that members of Parliament were consulting his collections to provide historical evidence to criticise his government. And in fact, they were doing so. Now, Camdens Preface explains that Cotton's library provided the greater part of all his documentary sources. But the drafts of the Annals and the Faustina manuscripts show that Cotton also played an important role in revising the text. And Cotton's name is actually scrawled all over one of the volumes, Faustina 4, and his hand appears in various places in the text itself. So we need to think a little bit more about this text as having a kind of collaborative authorship. Second, Collinson suggested that attention paid to the intricate detail of these manuscripts and the process by which Camden, Cotton and others drafted and revised it can be very revelatory of the judgments of perhaps more than one mind at work. Now, Collinson's preliminary consultation was very illuminating, although he only worked with a very small part of these manuscripts. And in particular, he focused on the way in which Camden and Cotton worked closely together, drafting and rewriting one of the most momentous episodes in the reign of Elizabeth, the execution for treason of Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. Now, in an era filled with drama, the story of Mary, Queen of Scots was the most sensational of all. Mary was Elizabeth's closest living kin on her father's side and had the best hereditary claim to the throne. She was also an ardent Roman Catholic. She'd been deposed from her Scottish throne by a faction of Protestant nobles and had escaped to England in 1568, where, despite her status and her relationship with Elizabeth, she was kept prisoner for 20 years. Groups of radical English Catholics who were inclined to foment deposition plots against their Protestant Queen Elizabeth saw Mary as their best hope for the restoration of the Roman Catholic Church. And so for Elizabeth's Protestant subjects, leading statesmen, clergy and courtiers, Mary was a major security threat and a threat to the survival of the Protestant Church and nation itself. And for almost 2 decades, they were thwarted by Elizabeth's refusal to have Mary tried for treason or even legally excluded from the law of succession. Finally, in 1586, in a plot orchestrated by Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, Mary was enticed into complicity with the Catholic gentleman Anthony Babington and tried for treason and sentenced to death for plotting Elizabeth's death. Now, this was a moment of great rejoicing for many of Elizabeth's counsellors, but it was also a great crisis of conscience for Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth had wanted rid of her cousin with her troubling claim to the throne, but she didn't want to have Mary's blood on her hands. So this was a subject that was full of extraordinary dramatic potential, but it was a minefield for Camden to negotiate, not least because it balanced the particular interests of his two very powerful patrons. On the one hand, the handling of Mary's death was of utmost importance for King James, who was Mary's son. And in fact, James's primary interest in prodding Camden into reviving and finishing his Elizabethan history emanated from a particular concern to establish a narrative of his mother's life that exonerated her from the stain of treason. On the other hand, Camden had also to preserve the reputation of William Cecil. not least as William's son, Robert, was James's chief minister. Now, during her lifetime, William Cecil had actually seen Mary, Queen of Scots, as the greatest security threat to the Protestant state. And he'd been Mary's most powerful antagonist during her life. He sponsors the kind of production of kind of anonymous or libelous pamphlets that denounced Mary as a kind of sexually incontinent, murdering tyrant. And Mary's exclusion from the throne had been William Cecil's perhaps the abiding obsession of his career. So Camden, with Cotton's help, has a very unenviable task of trying to exonerate the king's mother from the charge of treason, and yet to suggest that Cecil had nothing at all to do with Mary's death. The last 2 years of Mary's life in the Annals, her trial and execution, are the largest, most copious parts of the Annals, and they're amongst the most heavily annotated. The Latin narrative of Mary's downfall itself is a masterful piece of obfuscation. Camden removes any suggestion that Cecil or any named individual was in any way involved in Mary's downfall. Rather, Mary's enemies are not named as Elizabeth's chief counsellors, which they were. He presents them as completely anonymous malcontents, evil creatures of the court, he calls them auliki, who whispered poisonous lies that entrapped the poor, innocent Scottish queen. So he writes, and as those who bore mortal hatred against the Queen of Scots took occasion to hasten her death, they caused false rumours to be daily spread all over England with fearful outcries, such as that the Queen of Scots was escaped out of prison, had levied in armed power to kill the Queen. Such rumours as princes curiously, credulously do easily lay hold on. So he's suggesting that Elizabeth herself was inflamed by fear for her own security and therefore listened to these anonymous and terrifying rumours. Camden's portrait of Elizabeth's involvement is also very necessarily enigmatic. He explains that she signed Mary's death warrant, but had not intended to dispatch it, and this was done by one of her servants, William Davidson, without Elizabeth's knowledge. And Collinson demonstrated that Camden and Cotton agonized over the presentation of the Queen's motivations and response to Mary's death, and that each edited the other's Latin interpolations. So this image here is, I'll translate what the Latin says. It says, the final printed version in translation is, however angry she was against Davison, the grief Queen Elizabeth either conceived, as in felt, or pretended for the death of the Queen of Scots. Certain it is that King James felt genuine grief. Now, what you can see here is that this part has been revised and revised here by Camden and by Cotton. Now, Camden suggested that Elizabeth's public display of her cousin's beheading is either pretended or conceived, iram et dolorum conceperit au praesa tulerit, and presenting two plausible, options of psychological motivations is a very Tacitian kind of literary technique. On the one hand, this, on the one hand, that, to make up your own judgment, reader. But it's a formulation that they've only reached after an awful lot of rethinking. And the annotations suggest that this draft of the wording of the sentence has been revised at least 3 times before they alight on that final ambiguous phrasing, which doesn't condemn Elizabeth, but it doesn't exonerate her from faking grief for her cousin's death. While scholars read and admired Collinson's short essays, which are now 20 years old, his call for a thorough literary analysis of the text has gone unheeded. Most historians continue to use the Annals as a straightforward repository of factual information. I became intrigued by the manuscripts by accident when researching my own book on late Elizabethan politics and the life and thought of the circle around Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex. In particular, I was intrigued by the incident I described at the start of the paper, for which Camden's our only source, the famous scene at court where Elizabeth boxed Essex's ears. And I wondered if the manuscript would help me understand where the incident came from. So I called up, I called up Faustina manuscript F3, which covers the years 1593 to 1603, and the parallel manuscript that's also a kind of revision of those years. The manuscripts covering these years do show considerable times of revision and interpolations from Cotton's hand and possibly another scribe. But that famous confrontation between Elizabeth and Essex is nowhere to be found in the original draft or either of the manuscript versions. It must have been a later revision and a quick addition, I assume, to a final version of the printed text. From where did it spring? there's no evidence to suggest anywhere other than Camden's imagination. After I'd finished that monograph, I continued to think about the implications of this. And my interest in these earlier findings were revived. And I thought I'd have a more extensive look, both at the final printed text and at the manuscript drafts, to see if any of Collinson's suggestions for further inquiry could be fleshed out. I limited myself to the period of Elizabeth's reign I knew best, which was the last 10 years, from 1593 to 1603. And I mainly placed the Latin printed text next to material from the Faustina manuscripts. And so what did I discover? Read as a whole, there are some interesting immediate observations that one can make before even going to the manuscripts. You wouldn't have a sense from reading Camden's accounts of the later Elizabethan period was a time of socio-economic crisis. In fact, the 1590s were dogged by harvest failure, by dearth, heavy taxation, and conscription for war with Spain and in Ireland. Elizabeth's final parliaments were unusually turbulent, with very strong agitation from members of the House of Commons against unpopular fiscal policies of the Crown. Now, Camden, you may recall in his preface, claimed to have read every parliamentary diary, private records kept by some members of the House of Commons, assiduously. If he did, he passed very swiftly over suggestion of turmoil or conflict. Secondly, the text possesses an undeniable religious bias for a work written in the century after the Protestant Reformation of the English Church. Now, in his preface again, Camden argues that the writer of civil history, we'd say political history, has little to do with religious matters. And yet there's lots about religion in the Annals. Indeed, Camden's authorial judgment can often be most easily observed when he's denouncing religious extremities and those whose actions threaten to undermine the status quo in church and state. So while Camden's scathing of radical Catholics, especially Jesuits, whom he argues threatened the civil order, plotting against Elizabeth's life, he actually generally treats Elizabeth's Catholic subjects with great sympathy, flourishing several with very warm obituaries. He particularly admired Catholic scholars, so Thomas Stapleton, an Oxford Don, who'd taken himself into exile at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, and who's most famous amongst Elizabethan scholars for writing really bitey polemic against the Elizabethan Church. For Camden, admired him as the editor of Bede's Ecclesiastical History and writes a very warm obituary for him, describing him as a scholar whose fame blazed loud through the Republic of Letters. His obituary for Anthony Browne by St. Montague, who was a preeminent Catholic nobleman at the time, was considerably expanded and revised within the draft in several versions of this obituary. And the final version reads that Montague, who's actually excluded from the political establishment through his entrenched repudiation of the Protestant Church, was one of Elizabeth's favourite subjects, whom she held most dear because of his fidelity to her. Elizabeth knew that he maintained the religion out of the conviction of his mind, not out of the spirit of faction. So this revision has an important purpose, a clear purpose. It's possible, Camden's saying, for Catholics to be loyal and virtuous subjects. Above all, there's no sense that the final years of Elizabeth's reign was an era of religious persecution. The Annals essentially ignore the imprisonment and execution of Catholic priests and laymen that sporadically punctuated the later years of Elizabeth's reign. So in the 1590s, the Jesuit poet Robert Southwell was hanged and quartered, but it also laity were executed for assisting the priesthood. Here is Anne Line. Both of these figures are now saints, recognized as saints by the Catholic Church. There's no sense of this in Camden at all. Radical Protestants, Presbyterians also received rough and controversial justice in this period. Again, Camden largely ignores this. Elizabeth silently broke the force of her adversaries. I refer you to writings of divines who have written about such things. Finally, there's no sense that this era was plagued by doubts and anxieties about the royal succession, that there was any concern that the aging queen would not seamlessly be replaced by the adult male King of Scotland, James VI, whose path to the throne ironically had been cleared by his mother's execution. Now, the notion that the Protestant succession was obviously secure after the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, has been one of the most enduring, but also inaccurate myths about Elizabeth's reign. Until very recently, many scholars have assumed that James VI's accession was always on the cards, that he came south promising to usher in an era of peace and male kingship on the back of a generally accepted and understood path to the throne. In fact, tension and anxiety about the succession had plagued Elizabeth's reign and James's nightmares until the crown was very securely fixed on his head. The child-free Elizabeth refused for the whole of her reign to nominate her successor. She didn't want to create a rival whose authority would threaten her own. Laws were passed in Parliament that prohibited open discussion and speculation about the destination of the crown. And for much of her reign, including right into her final years, right until her death, Elizabeth's subjects envisaged the realm might slide into chaos and civil war, with Protestant and Catholic claimants vying for the throne, perhaps with the military support of foreign rulers. The Puritan Peter Wentworth, in a tract published in 1598, addressed to Elizabeth, warned the Queen that if she failed to nominate a successor, the rage and fury of hell and hellhounds would be unleashed, and the realm engulfed in civil war and foreign invasion. He wrote, "Oh, the rivers of blood, which then by these doleful consequences will overflow everywhere this noble island." Even King James himself was extremely anxious that his claim would be thwarted by plausible Catholic pretenders. Now, James was notoriously unmilitaristic, but in 1599, just a couple of years before Elizabeth died, he asked the Scottish Parliament for money to raise an army to fight for the English crown in battle should he have to do so. It's no coincidence that the great drama of this period, think of Shakespeare's history plays, Richard II, the Henry VI trilogy, Henry IV parts 1 and 2, revolve around the themes of civil war, usurpation, crisis of succession, the question of what makes a monarch legitimate. Now, there's none of that tension in Camden. No sense of these debates, covert and less covert, that were on the minds of all of the political elite. There's no suggestion that the succession is uncertain at all. And if we look at the draft manuscript of the Annals, the clarity and smoothness of James's accession has been firmed up in a host of major changes to the original text. Now, in particular, the Annals are the most famous source of the allegation that Elizabeth confirmed James's title with her dying words. "I will that a king succeed me, and who but my nearest kinsman, the King of Scots." Now, this is not corroborated by contemporary accounts at all. There's no other source that there are no sources that are contemporary that Elizabeth gave her verbal blessing to James, none. And if we look at the accounts in the Annals, they've been heavily reworked in revisions. So this is the account of Elizabeth's deathbed words. And you can see they're meant to go in at page 814, folio 814. This is a kind of note for insertion. And here is the place where they are going to be inserted. And you can see that even within that, it's being written and rewritten and thought and rethought. This is largely in Camden's own hand rather than that of Cotton, we think. But at the same time, it's very clearly a later edition deemed necessary. Now, we can speculate about the motivations of Camden and his collaborators, when and how and why they selected and honed this grand narrative, creating these drafts. Camden's hostility to Puritanism can be discerned elsewhere in his career. He seems to have blamed hotter Protestants and probably the Earl of Leicester for blocking his petition to proceed to the degree of Master of Arts at Oxford. We know that he maintained strong friendships with Catholic scholars throughout his adult life. As a former chorister and lover of church music, his religious preferences seem to have leaned to the traditional. On the other hand, the judgment in the text can't simply be understood through his own biography, his own personal preferences. We need to know far more about the multiple voices that seem to be embedded here and the patronage context within which Camden and his friend Cotton worked. One example is that Cotton, who was far more connected to the court directly than Camden, was a client of one of the leading Catholic noblemen of the day, Henry Howard, Earl of Northampton, who acted as a voice for Catholic toleration at the Jacobean court. Meanwhile, the repudiation of any religious activity that led to political disobedience was a message overwhelmingly representative of the politics of King James, who'd so narrowly escaped the terrorist atrocity planned by Guy Fawkes and the other gunpowder plotters in 1605. Of course, James's strong interests can be seen in the favourable presentation of his mother's life and the possibly seemingly invented story that the dying Elizabeth named him as an heir. So it seems clear that investigation of the literary techniques used to compose the Annals and a thorough understanding of the process of revision and editing will provide quite a different understanding of how we view this work as an authoritative source for Elizabeth I's reign. Around 5 years ago, my colleague Neil Younger, Tom Freeman and I applied for a research grant that would have funded a new translation and scholarly edition of the Annals. The Arts and Humanities Research Council deemed the project worthy, but not of sufficient public interest. Too esoteric, perhaps. Now, this was disheartening, but perhaps it was for the best. In lieu of an edited scholarly edition, Neil Younger and I decided to bid from one of the Arts and Humanities Research Council's doctoral scholarships that are granted to students who work with collaborative supervision between universities and public institutions. We thought that a thorough study of the making of Camdens Annals and the manuscripts in the British Library would be a brilliant subject for a young, talented scholar. We sounded out Julian Harrison at the British Library, who's long been obsessed with the Cotton Manuscripts. He was thrilled at the idea. We put in a successful bid for the scholarship and were able to appoint a wonderful young doctoral student, Helena Rakowska, who is currently in the second year of her doctorate at Oxford under our supervision, studying the manuscripts and the literary traditions of the Annals. Now, Helena has skills that Neil and I lack. She's got a first degree in classics, and she has a master's from the Warburg. So she's got both expertise in the classical literary traditions in which Camden works and brilliant expertise in early modern paleography. And therefore, she can far better understand the literary elements of Camden's text and to tease out the secrets that manuscripts provide. So while all Elizabethan historians may have to revise our confidence in Camden's Annals as our foundation of the assumptions about the Elizabethan era, and we may need Archer Camden to strip him a title he never imagined for himself as founder of modern historical method, it may be that by exploring this deeply complicated but fascinating text, the Annals may come to be seen as his most famous work.
Well, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating deconstruction of the Annals. And I've read Britannia many times, but I'd never looked at the Annals. So it was intriguing to find out more about it. And I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. So please put your hand up and we can bring the microphone to you.
Thank you. Do any contemporary commentaries survive, which were written shortly after the Annals were published, which actually repudiate any of the facts?
No. There are not actually. We know that Camden was very reluctant for the final part to go into print, and it was only published after he died. Now with Britannia, you do have an attack on Camden's accuracy by one of the heralds, Ralph Brooke, but there's not the same kinds of, it seems to, people are not kind of making these claims to accuracy about Elizabeth's life in the same kind of way. I think it's seen as a different sort of work. What we do have is a deal of kind of correspondence around the presentation of Mary Queen of Scots that I didn't go into. So the French historian who was writing this sort of huge compendious history that used very anti-Marian sources. And one of the reasons that James wanted Camden to write was to refute what was going to be the kind of major Latin European understanding of his mother's history and life. But no, there's nothing that I know of that discusses this.
It may be seen as slightly off-piste actually, but I was thinking as you was talking about the appetite for history and the politicization, I was thinking about Stowe's Survey of London. And I mean, do you want to say a little bit about their relationship?
Camden and Stowe, or the survey? Right, so I suppose Stowe's survey is much more in the kind of vein of Camden with his antiquarian hat on, which is actually, you know, he writes the first kind of account of Westminster Abbey and its monuments. And Stowe's London is very much in that vein. So the history is quite unlike anything else he writes. And as such, I suppose I'm trying to suggest that it's a very, very different kind of work to Britannia. And that to work as to think of yourself as writing, as being, people thought very separately about antiquarian research from history writing, which they saw as this kind of, literary genre. I don't have a sense of whether or not Camden and Stowe knew each other, and they possibly did, and I should know that, but I've come at this from an Elizabethan political historian interested in the Annals rather than the other way around.
Thank you, Alex, for a wonderful paper. And I completely agree that Camden isn't entirely reliable as a source. On the first page, he gives the date of Anne Boleyn's birth as 1507, and he's the first person who does that, and then gives a whole host of facts in that first paragraph that are inaccurate. But people rely on the 1507 date. But the question I wanted to ask you was why you assume that with later editions, moving from the manuscript versions to the print, we then have an edition of something in the instance of the confrontation that is from his imagination. I was thinking of the parallel example of later editions of Fox, where we know that he is relying on more eyewitnesses that have emerged. And given that we don't know where Camden's getting anything from anyway, how can we disprove that?
We can't. And I'm being provocative, suggesting I think that some things might be things of his imagination. Where Cotton gets very involved in the manuscripts often seems to concern Scottish matters. So matters that might directly impact on James's sensibilities, and Cotton is the person with the court connections. So it does seem to be intentional. It may well be that there is, for example, with the earboxing incident, some kind of oral source that comes forward. What surprises me is that it doesn't appear in any other attempts to write Essex's life at the time. Even in the Jacobean period, it's not really taken up. So if it is an oral source, there's no other kind of sense of where that's from. And I'm just, may well be that there is, some kind of record behind it, but there's no way of saying that there necessarily is. I think that's the point I would try and make.
Do you know much about who was reading it at the time of publication and whether his patrons read it?
Well, at the time of publication, do we have a sense of who is reading it? It seems to have been popular because it's translated. It's very hard to find. I mean, and there's a great deal of interest in Elizabeth I's reign under the early Stuarts because having grumbled about many aspects of her reign while living under her, the seeming deficiencies of the Stuart rule starts to cause people to reappraise Elizabeth and think that she is, and to use her as a kind of mirror to criticize the Jacobeans. Now, I don't think Camden's doing that exactly, but there's a great deal of interest. Hence, it's quite unusual that there are so many early translations and one into French as well. 3 by 1630. So, and it's a huge work. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
In Camden's letters, he corresponds with Francis Sweart.
Yeah.
And I'm very lucky to actually possess the copy that Camden sent to him. And what's interesting about it is that,
Suarez.
yeah, in Antwerp, and he says, I told you I'd received your most welcome present the annals of your country under Queen Elizabeth in the year 1589. I have read it and reread it. And then letter 3 months later says, everybody is here reading your annals most avidly. Regrettably, there is but one copy in our town, which I owe to you, and that is never in my library, been constantly coming and going. A certain Jesuit father, a far from negligible man, has read and reread it and praised it wondrously. And what's interesting is that that copy has almost no signs of anybody having read it, except some underlining mostly relating to Mary Queen of Scots. So
Right.
that
Yeah,
really
that's
does,
fascinating.
I think, lose state
Mm.
saying.
But I think that goes to show that there's an audience that is actually an international audience, which is why he writes in Latin and why it's also why it leads up to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, which is the big sort of issue for James. And then the final part of Elizabeth's reign, almost as if Camden really doesn't want to write it, but does so. But that's really amazing about Suarez. Of course, Suarez's works are burned publicly, aren't they, under James? Oh, I thought you said Suarez. I thought you said Francisco Suarez. No, I was very surprised at that. Okay, sorry, no, I didn't know the letter. Right, okay. I was astonished by the idea that Suarez would have been reading. No, sorry, that's my mishearing. But yes, I think there's meant to be an international audience for this. And I do think that there's I think there's a very kind of unusually, not exactly pro-Catholic line, but certainly not anti-Catholic line that's quite strong once you start thinking about reading the text, what it doesn't contain. Of the Latin. So there are English translations. There are 3 English translations by 1630, although they're not complete. And there's a whole. The first edition is 1615. The second part is published in 1625, and then there's a whole edition published in 1630, and another version of that is published in the 1670s. I mean, it's a huge work. So there aren't. I should really be completely on top of that, shouldn't I? It's not the case that it goes through Ian Green's 5 editions test to prove something's popular, but neither does Fox's Acts and Monuments. It's a very, very massive work print, actually. So there aren't lots and lots of editions, but there are these early translations. Yeah, I think so. I suppose it's because it's maybe. I suppose it doesn't fit the people who've been interested in Camden have rightly been interested in his in what he was pioneering, and I think this isn't pioneering. I think it's very much in this kind of older tradition of historical writing.
Any evidence that he drew on Holinshed's 2nd edition or on Buchanan or Stanyhurst or any of the other historiographers?
Right, okay, so he doesn't, he doesn't really talk about, so no one's done this. It could be that he's drawn on Holinshed, but, and I'm only, I barely scratched the surface of the literary sources there because he doesn't name any sources he uses. Certainly one of the things he's trying to do, though, is to refute George Buchanan's history of Scotland and refute the kinds of very hostile depiction of Mary Queen of Scots in that. And that's one of the kind of key reasons that James wants him to write this work. And Elizabeth gets a tiny obituary, not really an obituary at all. Mary's obituary describes what a great and noble lady she is, what a kind of blameless and wonderful life she's had. It's quite striking.
I remember once sort of watching Bruce Wernham at work in his study. He actually wrote the year by year accounts for his analyses of the state papers foreign by having open before him in his study Camden's Annals, Stowe's Annals, and other works. He had his own copies, half a dozen or so, and they filled a large desk surface. But I was thinking, actually, that's just preliminary to my question, which is that I wonder, can you say that, would you have to say that Camden so adapted and altered his sources that you cannot find in them the state papers that Cotton had acquired, which must have been the basis for quite a chunk of what he puts into the annals.
Right. Well, no one's done this. I think that's a great question. I can find that there are certain manuscripts in Cotton's collection that Camden is the only historian, only contemporary, slightly later contemporary to use, and he's clearly drawing on Cotton's collection. But he does so there are some debates about whether or not England should stay should stay at war with Spain or make peace with Spain. A series of kind of anonymous manuscript treaties, quite a few of which are only preserved in the Cotton papers. And Camden uses them, but he does prune them, and he puts them into a very specific kind of context of debates at court. It might be that those are the contexts within which they were used, but it's not clear from the manuscripts themselves. Now, that's a tiny little snapshot of what you can do and can't do, but this is why it requires somebody to go and make this very kind of arduous journey through the Cotton papers and to actually look at how these sources have been used. Exactly. It's be very time consuming and painstaking to do.
As an 18th century historian, I always want to push people to go further forward from the early modern period. And as I think interested in the subsequent reception of the annals, and you mentioned that they're reprinted in the 17th century. What happens to them after that in the 18th, 19th century? I mean, obviously, Trevor Roper seizes on them to make his argument about Camden as a professional historian, but what's the sort of reputation of the annals? Do you have a sense of that after the 17th century?
I mean, I think they're the go-to place to write about Elizabeth from, but largely in the English translation. I mean, I haven't got a kind of developed sense of that, but they certainly shape the kinds of ways that Elizabeth's reign is presented. But no, I have a really bad answer, isn't it? I don't really.
No. I just wondered. It opens up this possibility that deconstructing or taking apart the annals, how much more of the image of Elizabeth we have to
very much so.
deconstruct.
I suppose the one thing I'd say is that it's not a very positive image of Elizabeth. I mean, it's not unpositive, but where you'd expect, and actually this is where some of the translations are quite misleading. So the English translations have these really beautiful, engravings of Elizabeth and talk about this being the kind of reign of the great Elizabeth. Whereas she appears as a kind of very enigmatic character. But there's a speech where Elizabeth declares that she's going to stay married to the country that Camden says she makes in her first parliament. And again, he's the only source of the speech. So the extent to which we do construct from.
Certain ideas we rely on, which completely
Yeah.
insubstantial.
Well, it might have been true.
Might have been true, but we don't know.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? If not, thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating, opening up all sorts of possibilities. So thinking about the text as well as about Elizabeth. And I now give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 23rd of February at 5 p.m, when we'll hear a paper, Shedding New Light on Old Treasure, re-examining the Iron Age hoards from Snettisham, Norfolk. That will be given by Dr. Julia Farley, FSA, and Dr. Jodie Joy, FSA. So meeting stands adjourned.